Okay. What's up? How's your day? Hope you're doing well. I am David Long, you know what it is. I'm coming in to hang out with you guys today and to talk a little bit about enlightenment and mysticism and non-dual perspective and how these ideas relate to integral as a stage of development. Because in our community, there is a lot of talk about these things, right? Like enlightenment, and mysticism, non-dual perspective, and it's also almost seen like what it means to be at an integral stage is to be a mystic. This is what seems to be implied by a lot of people. People at the integral stages are mystics, and it's almost as if people don't see that mysticism is actually born at earlier stages. Like there's definitely blue mystics and green mystics, and if we can't make a distinction between what it means to be a mystic at these different stages, and we're just saying mystics are at these higher stages, or what it is to be at these higher stages is to be a mystic, is to basically open the door to the pre-trans fallacy, mistaking pre-rational dogmatic ideas with some kind of trans-rational glory. And that's what we see basically run prevalent through our entire community. And, you know, Wilbur is one of the main people who are doing this too. And so, of course, it's a problem in his community because he's doing it. So, buy the merch. Anyways, let's talk about enlightenment. So let's start there. What is enlightenment and how does it relate to development? So I would define enlightenment as the realization of absolute unity and interconnectedness. The realization of absolute unity and interconnectedness. Okay, so the realization. This word realization is a big part of it because we want to say realization's a verb. So it's not just like, realized it, I'm done. This is one of the major problematic distinctions when people start saying things like, I'm enlightened. People are confused by what it means in the first place to be enlightened. They think it's some kind of superhuman goal or achievement on the first hand to be enlightened. And then if it is this kind of a realization, does that mean that you're really living it out? Like you're perfectly realizing what it is to live from this perspective of unity and interconnectedness. So there's this idea of it's like an amazing, huge accomplishment to become enlightened, and that it almost like makes you a perfect being or something. So both of these things I would say are wrong. They are bad ideas. Enlightenment was historically born, as we talked about last time, at Blue. You start to see these people who at Blue are having these existential awakenings, but they can only still talk about it in the light of their tradition. Or maybe it even extends the tradition from the ethnocentric framing into a more world-centric framing, and then you get a more world-centric creedal type of figure. But I mean, it's still ends up getting translated from lower perspectives and stuck in a particular type of symbol set, even if the person like Jesus or Buddha, you know, assuming that those are historical characters and not mythical characters, actually had a mind-blowing realization beyond their cultural conditioning. And this is why I wouldn't want to reduce enlightenment or this realization of absolute unity and interconnectedness to being just an Eastern thing. It's a universal theme. We have it in Buddhism, all is one. We have it in Christianity, I and the Father are one. And you have it in paganism, the web of life and the idea of Gaia, the goddess, and how we're all united within it. So the difference, I would say, is that the more idealistic themes tend to either put God out there somewhere as some kind of separate transcendent thing, or underneath as some kind of fundamental universal source or ground of being. And so to get in touch with the absolute is to either get in touch with the transcendent Father or the absolute source, the ground of being. Whereas in the more pagan traditions, there is no transcendent, there is only the immanent. Maybe if there is a transcendent source, it's something like energy, where we're all equals MC squared, we're all the universe in flux. And so there's different concepts of how to translate this universal idea of enlightenment. And from this emergentist perspective, from a transrational perspective, where we are interested in cashing out our symbols reasonably, it seems like the most reasonable version of enlightenment is not intersubjective unity and interconnectedness, but actually more the interobjective unity and interconnectedness. That is actually a fact. So this is where it would also be interesting to make a distinction between what we would generally call the Eastern Enlightenment project and the Western Enlightenment project. Although technically I'm going to say they're just different kind of approaches to the same project. Even science is a type of mystery school, a type of spiritual relationship to the universe where you appreciate its mystery and you find yourself as a humble seeker of truth through this kind of method and process. It's a type of modern religion. And this doesn't mean that scientific knowledge is reducible to dogma, okay? Because dogma means authority that's unquestioned, right? So I'm not trying to conflate science and religion in that kind of a way. But what I'm saying is that even the act of science, even though it's often treated as if it's this secular, materialistic kind of thing, for a lot of people, it is actually a spiritual practice itself. I mean, there's a great talk by Neil deGrasse Tyson where he talks about how he feels called by the universe to study it.
I became a student of the universe with the ambition of one day being one of its participants in research on the frontier of cosmic discovery. And that ambition, that inculcation, stayed with me the whole time. To the point where when you become an astrophysicist, when you become a scientist at all, you would go on pilgrimages to mountaintops because that's where your telescopes are. And so that's part of the pilgrimage. There's the effort of the travel, and then there's the effort of flipping your schedule and going nocturnal. Then there's the telescope itself, this conduit to the cosmos. It's a tube. It's a conduit. And I sit there and I reflect on it. My specialty was the center of the Milky Way galaxy, 30,000 light years away. And so I have my digital detectors, I've got the telescope, it's dark, it's just me on this mountain and the universe. And I look up and I just think to myself, there are photons that have been traveling for 30,000 years. And I'm sort of snatching them from this journey and planting them into my digital detector. So there's not only the fact that I'm on the mountaintop, there's the knowledge and the feeling that I'm reaching out to the universe with these methods and tools of science.
And how he makes this pilgrimage up to the mountaintop to stare through this conduit to the heavens and contemplate the mystery of the universe, which is also his mystery. And he's deeply caught up in awe while he's also doing his rigorous science to try and seek for truth. So there is a scientific version of enlightenment as well as a traditional version of enlightenment. And remember, I have defined enlightenment as the realization of absolute unity and interconnectedness. This is a scientific fact. There's a reason that we call this the Enlightenment, the Western Enlightenment Project, more at Orange, is about trying to figure out how the parts relate to the whole. So science, as I was saying, is part of this Western Enlightenment Project, is part of this mystical approach to truth seeking. These are seekers of truth who appreciate ultimate mystery, and they realize that they will never get at the absolute truth, but they seek to know more. They want to know how the parts relate to the whole. Now, it's interesting because when people tell the story of like the Garden of Eden, or if they tell the story in Buddhism, they will start to say that the beginning of separation was in naming everything. Through naming things, through giving things names, you start to believe that we're separate. But it's interesting, through the culmination of naming things, of understanding how the parts relate to the whole, it comes back around and we realize that we're all interconnected. It gets proven objectively. So this is that knowledge of good and evil and the circular journey of the fool, or like getting kicked out of the garden of innocence where God and man are one in this kind of naive way, to this higher return and realization to where God and man are one in this mature way, because we've factually proven it. In the story of the Garden of Eden, when they talk about, and they do talk about it like we need to kick these humans out because if they eat of this second tree of everlasting life, they'll be like us. So to come back around into the garden and to eat from both trees of the garden is to be like the gods, is to be this mature being of being in form, if you want to speak about it poetically in the light of Christian symbolism. So let's talk about these different levels of enlightenment. The early level of enlightenment is something like a rebirth, like I'm born again, like I can transcend my ego and my pride and living for myself or living for my culture and live for God. Unfortunately, at that level, at Blue, the concept of God is still very in the box. It's still very traditional. It's very rarely actually at this post-conventional kind of understanding. I mean, I think it could be, but it generally gets interpreted in that kind of level. And until you're really at a trans-rational or postmodern kind of view, it's really hard to say that these people really understand the relative nature of language and symbolism, and they're not really taking any of it literally. Maybe to some extent, you do have a little bit of that because people early on who are coming up with mythology, like at the very early stages, like the tribal stages, people who are still like grasping at the ability to try and wrap things in language, they might be a little bit more aware of the fact that they're trying to talk about something that's just beyond their capability of being able to realize. Some traditions at their core do try to emphasize this, but it's still often translated from traditional blue, simplistic, literal perspectives. Islam is an example of a tradition that's really good about not trying to idolize God or personify God or represent God in a particular way. God is a mystery beyond a human's ability to fully fathom. And yet, still with them, we do see very traditional, very blue, very personified concepts of God, and definitely script pathology around it. Even though Buddha was very explicit in saying, I'm not a god, I'm just awake, people still go up to Buddha idols and pray to Buddha and worship Buddha. This blue translation will definitely happen. Joseph Campbell has a great quote that says, your ultimate name, image, and concept of God is your ultimate boundary from God. And so to really have a religious experience is not to conform to some kind of conventional, traditional concept of God, but to actually break past those conceptual idols into this realm of pure mystery. The further on through development where people are indoctrinated into these kinds of stories, it is really hard for them to really break out of those stories and symbols because they're not really at this existential, postmodern, post-rational place to where they can understand the relative nature of language itself. And so when you look at Buddha or Christ and these symbols and these figures, like Buddha's awakening is still framed in the context of the Hindu creation myth. His idea of transcending to source, it's the reverse of the Hindu creation myth. There was this being of beings who was all that there was. He thought and then felt afraid, and then said, why am I afraid? And then felt desire, and then split into multiple beings and create the world. So the idea is for Buddha is that he cancels desire, which cancels fear, which cancels I, which gets him back to the source, right? So it's very much inside the tradition thinking about what enlightenment means. And when Jesus says, I and the Father are one, this is still, again, very inside the tradition concepts of what it is to be reborn or enlightened or awakened or something. So blue enlightenment is a thing, but it is often still pre-rational and in the box. Orange enlightenment is a thing, but it is often limited to feelings of awe and wonder and amazement. And it can also still be within a modern rational kind of box. Some of these people will still not be able to really incorporate poetry or metaphor or any of this. It's still a rigorous scientific practice. And even when Neil deGrasse Tyson is admitting he's using this more spiritual language in this room full of scientists, he's actually doing a really bold and progressive thing in that community where even a lot of the scientific community is starting to move more into green and postmodern perspectives. You can get the flavor of enlightenment. Okay, and green enlightenment, I would say this is where real enlightenment really starts to come online. Like this is early stage vision logic. Green enlightenment is the existential awakening, the beginning of being able to really get ego and construct awareness, this deconstruction. It's like we understand the relative nature of language itself. We've not only transcended our one cultural condition, but we've realized that there's value and truth in all of these ways of talking about things, and it's all just ways of talking about things. So this really starts to help us to see the map from the territory in ways that at blue and orange, we just really weren't able to get to yet. So having this realization in hand, you can actually start to see that, okay, the stories that we tell each other or that we talk about are relative, and even the stories that I tell about myself are still deeply embedded in this past victim self kind of narrative. So the problem is that a lot of times when we see green talking about their enlightenment and their wokeness, they still tend to think of it in this binary kind of way, right? Where there's like people who are woke and there's people who are asleep. And they also tend to be like, okay, well, the ego is bad, mind is bad, fear is bad, love is good. Unity is good. So these people tend to be very confused. And this is where the performative self-contradiction is constantly coming in, where it's like they're trying to be all in love and not use their mind and use their heart and not judge and go with the flow and all that stuff. But to do that, they're making judgments and it becomes this egoic posturing thing, and they get all caught up in this contradiction. So it's actually at integral where we start to develop diversity with discernment and personal level integration and non-dual perspective. So I would say, depending on how you understand it, as long as your non-dual perspective isn't corrupted by the bias of a particular symbol set and its assumptions as if they are the absolute truth, then a non-dual perspective is a healthy form of integral. Basically, what this non-dual perspective means is that you're able to hold this absolute truth realization that we're all one, that we're all interconnected, as well as the relative truth. And the reason why it has to be more hard agnostic, in line with science, emergentist, the more interobjective, actually provably true interpretation of this enlightenment is because it's in line with relative truth as we understand it to be. Whereas these other pre-rational claims are exactly that, pre-rational claims about the absolute truth that are unfounded and pre-scientific, and they don't stand. But going back to this idea of the absolute truth of everything's connected, everything's one, unity, and also the relative truth of I'm David, I'm still this limited person. The idea of both your unique self, your own strengths and limits and things that you bring to the table, as well as this enlightened self where you realize that I and the Father are one, or I am the source of all of this playing itself out. I am the universe in flux at the cutting edge, here and now, like actively engaged in it, right? So the good thing about this is that we can do a good job of avoiding the false pride of claiming to be it exclusively just you, and the false humility of not claiming your enlightenment. One can certainly be off balance and be too much absolute, not enough relative, too much subjective and not enough objective. Not really giving equal emphasis to all the quadrants, not really giving equal emphasis to the different aspects that are at play. And this is the common problem that we see in green. But again, the cognitive line runs ahead and the moral line has to do work to catch up. In spiral dynamics is the values line, and that's why we generally keep that as an understanding of our general altitude. You might have some ideas that run ahead, you might have moral lines that you need to get pulled up, and we see that in terms of enlightenment. It's one thing to realize that all is one and that we're all connected, and it's a whole other thing to really live like that's the case. And I've talked before about early, mid, and late stage versions of vision logic. The early stage is the green kind of vision logic. I'm saying it's a little bit too extreme dualistic. It is woke, but it creates the flatland. You guys are all familiar with the common criticisms of green. Early integral stage is good with this non-dual perspective, but sometimes it can end up conflating things into the mountaintop that it prefers because it's more of a personal integration, an integration and a map that's good for me because I'm trying to figure out what's going on. And then at this late stage vision logic, it's more about trying to wring out personal bias and get at these true universals so that way we can systematize without bias. So at these levels, we would maybe want to create, this new integral religion that initiates people into these mystical enlightenment and non-dual practices in a way that will hopefully avoid the superstition of thinking that one way of talking about it is literally true and the divisiveness that goes along with symbol absolutism around those things. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about mysticism for a second. Okay, so here's the definition of mysticism. Belief that union with or absorption into the deity or absolute or the spiritual apprehension of knowledge inaccessible to the intellect may be attained through contemplation and self-surrender. So the part that I take issue with in this definition is this idea that you can get inaccessible knowledge to the intellect, or like that you can know things beyond your mind or beyond reason or something like that. That is actually some pre-rational stuff. So this idea that we can know things beyond the mind is not really how knowing things works. We know things with our minds, we understand things with concepts, and this is part of integral philosophy. We understand that we interpret any experience through our stage of cognitive development with the linguistic tools we have access to, with the concepts we can use to hold things with. This is why the way that humans always talk about God or the absolute is always in the context of metaphors that we understand. Oh, it was an all-knowing man. Oh, it was consciousness. Oh, it's like a computer simulation. All of these concepts that we know about are what we use to try and interpret reality. So to say that you can know things beyond mind is not really possible, is not really to know things, because no matter what, you're always going to be interpreting it, which means that you're probably taking the relative symbol sets you're using for granted, and maybe even over-glorifying personal experience. I talk about this stuff more in my epistemology video, link in the description. I would say mysticism is about an absorption into the deity or the absolute through contemplation and self-surrender. But maybe a better way to put it would be, it's about having a sacred relationship with life and about seeing yourself in relation to this grand narrative. So this is the absorption into the deity through self-surrender. Part of it is dying to this, again, this limited victim narrative of like, oh, I'm this way because all of these things happen to me to make me this. The kind of stories that we get stuck in, and realizing this more absolute big picture kind of narrative of like, I'm the universe in flux. I'm the universe becoming conscious of itself. I am this being of beings moving through form, through time. I am the universe in flux. And seeing yourself as the process gives you a sacred relationship to the process. It gives you meaning and it gives life purpose. And it makes everything that you do important, and it gives you responsibility. So I'm all about this idea of how religion can relate you back to this big picture grand narrative, can link you back, right? Religio, linking back, linking the individual back to this big picture narrative. And it helps give us perspective in the moment and to see everything we do in this kind of sacred way. To me, this is what it is to be a mystic. And I do think that it's healthy to include this stuff. And I do think that it's healthy to include these things at a transrational, transpersonal stage. If you have good faith and a good relationship to life and you're a healthy person, you'll use metaphor and poetry and symbolism to help with this mystical thing. Because to be a mystic in this regard is to oppose the problem of nihilism, of the empty, meaningless void of who gives a shit? Why do we even care? Like, why does it even matter? Fuck it, who cares? I give up. I'm gonna live for me. That stuff. Mysticism is the healthy counteractant to that, because if we're here, if we're a part of this stuff, if we're going to have a healthy relationship to life, we're going to try and we're going to take it seriously, and we're going to realize that we're all stuck in this thing. We're all victims of circumstance, and that we should be sweet to each other and love each other and help each other and support each other, and that we should try. So it's like about saying yes to life and seeing life as sacred and important and meaningful, and it's super healthy and important. But the problem is when it gets these pre-rational ideas in there, then you start getting into superstition and divisiveness, and it kind of counteracts this stuff, and it's not really woke. People end up thinking they're woke when they're deeply superstitious and caught up in some childish bullshit. So this is why the pre-trans distinction is the key distinction that we need to be making around these topics, because it really helps to separate the baby from the dirty bathwater. So if you don't know, I have made a ton of videos about the pre-trans fallacy. Basically, there are two versions of the pre-trans fallacy. The first version, pre-trans fallacy number 1, is usually committed by people who are at orange, and basically they reduce anything that's non-rational to childish pre-rational bullshit. And the second version of the fallacy, pre-trans fallacy number 2, is when people who are at green and early integral stages want to try and lift pre-rational ideas up as if they're transrational. So pre-rational ideas are magical and mythical, rational ideas are rational, and transrational ideas are poetic or metaphoric. So the poetic and metaphoric transcends and includes rationality, because the poetry cashes out and proves to be true. I have a whole playlist of videos about the pre-trans fallacy, and I will link them in the description. Enlightenment and mysticism, when it's done responsibly, is about saying yes to life in the face of this nihilistic void and emptiness, this decision to try and to care and to take life seriously, to live for the bigger picture. I have said that I think it's healthy to be a mystic as opposed to a nihilist, although probably if we're including all perspectives, part of the existential awakening and realization is to really grapple with nihilism in this kind of way, to realize that there is no inherent meaning and purpose, and that what it is to be a mystic in some sense is to create and believe in and create together meaning and purpose, to find meaning and purpose in a inherently meaningless world. Now, that's not to say that there aren't actually real beings in this world that struggle and feel pain, and like that's real, and they count. These people's feelings count. So it's not like there's not such thing as the objective truth of beings who experience things. So when we're talking about inherent meaning or inherent telos or inherent purpose or something, we're talking about some kind of predetermined grand purpose from the beginning that was given by some transcendent source. Like, that is a pre-rational idea. So the jewel of the existential awakening is this: let's take personal responsibility for who and what I am and how we live together. This is why, to me, enlightenment really happens at green, because the versions of enlightenment that we see at orange and blue are still stuck in their symbol sets. They really are not awake in terms of being able to see past our ways of talking about things, to really be in touch with this grand mystery. Let's talk about spiritual practice just a little bit. At blue, spiritual practice is going to be a lot about being good and not being bad, dying to yourself and living for God. Unfortunately, at blue, the concept of God is usually really small and inside the traditional box. And so are the concepts of good and bad. At orange, spiritual practice is about caring about the truth, no matter what the truth proves to be. And honestly, this is what logic and rationality and the scientific method are all about. Trying to go past personal experience to try and find what the actual truth of the matter is. In green, the spiritual practice is a lot about being here now with no judgments and with an acceptance of everything that is. Being able to love and care about everything. Being able to see the good and the beautiful and the true in everything. Oftentimes, unfortunately, this ends up being kind of anti-intellectual, and it even falls into a lot of the same problems we see with spiritual bypassing at blue. So as we said, green is the beginning of enlightenment, this observing, witnessing, being here now, and we need that in order to be able to transcend our impulsive, egoic worldviews that we've been conditioned into and the habitual patterns of mind. Basically, green is all about learning to deconstruct the cultural conditioning that has been imposed on us so we can get something closer to a more pure and objective perspective. So at integral stages, it's the beginning of becoming and creating, this sort of early stage spiral wizardry, where we're trying to be skillful for the person, for the context, for development. And actually, it's this conscious living, consciously creating your life, consciously becoming who you decide you want to be, that is sort of a next level spiritual practice that a lot of people aren't really onto. And actually, this is why I advocate for some more of the pagan magic kind of practices, not just the Buddhist being practices, because there's this whole becoming that's involved in evolutionary spirituality, is how we talk about it at Integral, where we see evolution itself and participating in what evolution is doing as a spiritual practice. Now, in Integral and other postmodern worldviews generally, there's kind of an idealistic leaning towards these ideas, where they tend to frame these things in a very, the universe is spirit kind of a way of looking at things. But I like to think of it in this very transrational way, where it's like the culmination of ego and construct awareness, to where we have the ability to change the narrative and change the story and manipulate ourselves and the circumstances to achieve our goals in time. So this is where willpower, self-mastery, and magic come in. Magic with a K, not with a C. Not like, I'm doing magic, like tricks and things that aren't possible. No, I'm talking about magic, like harnessing your will and using practices and ceremonies to make things come true. I think a very practical example that everyone can relate to is marriage.
Marriage.
Two people get together, they do a ceremony, they exchange vows and tokens, and then from then on think about themselves and each other differently in relation to this new idea. We are married. Now, is that a true fact about the nature of reality, or is that something that they believe in and play out, and thus they make it true through their action and belief? So I think the creation of self, the creation of your life, can be done in this kind of consciously created way from this higher perspective, where you're transpersonal, you're beyond your limited stories and concepts of the ego, to the point to where you can create yourself. You decide who you're going to be. You decide what your principles are. You decide how you act. And construct awareness, not being stuck in one limited perspective, not being stuck in one limited story, but being able to change the story and tell new stories, to be able to reframe things and make things a particular way. So we use narrative, we use story, we use the fact that language is relative to make things come true in the world. So this can be done in one's personal life at mid-stage vision logic, or at yellow, or at early integral stages, and at integrally informed stages. These practices can be taken to a higher level to be able to affect change in the world, not just spiral wizarding for me and the people who I happen to run across, but I'll be spiral wizarding on this whole new level where now the ways, the stories that I tell and the things that I set up and the systems that I put in place change the world forever. So these are the different levels of spiritual practice, from blue all the way up to an integrally informed stage. Now, I know a lot of people are critical about this idea of a third tier. I actually am kind of okay with it if it's qualified properly. Like, I don't think that you get any kind of magic powers or anything like that. But I do think that you can get to a point of such self-mastery to where you don't even have to think about it anymore. And it just sort of easily happens through you. And maybe this is something like what third tier is like. No longer having to practice at the game of chess of becoming and spiral wizarding. You're so much of a spiral wizard chess master that it's just easy. You can just play on autopilot. You've played these games 1,000 times before. You know what the moves are. It's not even a thing anymore. Okay, that's what I think about spiritual practice up the spiral at these different levels. Okay, I think I've kind of touched on this. Still down with enlightenment, and I don't think it's a bad thing to claim that you're enlightened. I actually don't think it's a big deal to claim you're enlightened, because you can be enlightened at green. Green is enlightened. You know what's better than enlightened? Integrally informed. Integrally informed is enlightened plus. If you say that you're integrally informed, I will assume that you're enlightened, that you're better than enlightened. Enlightenment is not some ultimate goal of life or some superhuman achievement. I think it depends on how you qualify it. I guess I'm saying I don't think it's a big deal to be enlightened. I don't think it means that you're perfect or that you know anything. And I guess I'm trying to say that we should demystify it, because it's not really a big deal. It's more like the first step of being awake, and it's not like an ultimate goal. To realize that we're all connected is not really that big of a deal. Maybe it was a big deal in Buddha's time, 2,500 years ago, before there was science, before we had microscopes and telescopes, and we had to talk about things in this very kind of poetic, vague way, and we had no idea of the fractal nature of reality. It was a really hard thing to wrap your mind around. But now we live in the Enlightenment. It's common knowledge, like no big deal to be enlightened. Now, if you say, I'm enlightened, and what you mean is, I'm perfect, or I have this superhuman thing beyond other people, then yeah, that's, again, where you've gone away from humility and all this stuff. But on the other hand, again, I do think that it's kind of a problem when we can't make a distinction about what it means to be enlightened and hold each other to that kind of standard. Like, hey, you say that you know that we're all connected, but are you really living like we're all connected? Are you really living up to your enlightenment? This is a universal idea. And I said that there are different variations on the idea. We went through the Buddhist, the Christian, the pagan, the scientific, and this version of it, the realization of absolute unity and interconnectedness, is the universal. And then there are different particular inflections. Joseph Campbell talks about it as like a universal truth that appears in different cultural costumes.
For the sake of this video, can you explain why it is pre-rational to think that once we are enlightened, we will be able to access new ways of knowing things beyond thinking? I see a lot of people thinking that this is what you will get once you get enlightened, and I'm interested to know if this idea came from how the old teachers reacted in exaggerated ways to enlightenment as a big deal, while it is not that big today for us in our level of development as humans.
Right. Basically, what this is pre-rational projections of enlightenment. Imagine if you're hanging out with a spiral wizard and you're kind of in a less mature, less developed person. You're hanging out with them and it seems like, wow, they just have this kind of magnetism about them.
Magnetism. Magnetism.
They're just really able to somehow get past people's blocks and really speak to them in a way where they're able to move them in this kind of like magical sort of way.
Drop your weapons!
It's okay that we're here.
It's okay that you're here.
It's good.
You're relieved that we're here.
Thank goodness you're here.
Welcome, guys.
Did she do that to us?
It's almost like they know things about this person that they don't even know about themselves. It's like amazing. Now, you could interpret this in a very magical way, or you could understand that these are just practical things that come online. So basically what we're talking about here is a blue interpretation, a pre-rational interpretation of what it is to be a mystic, as if being a mystic gives you magical powers or makes you superhuman or has something to do with perfection. These are some of the childish ideas from the past that need to be put into a more rational perspective and understood in the light of a modern conception of development and what is actually possible. We have pretty good evidence that no one has ever been able to demonstrate any kind of paranormal abilities under any kind of rational scrutiny, not in any kind of scientific context, even when there are huge prizes available for lots and lots and lots of money. If these people could really do these things, they would be proving it and the whole world would know about it. So when people think about enlightenment and mysticism in this kind of a way, it's a pre-trans fallacy, number 2. So far, I haven't said much about my own personal experience, because I'm not here to give you my testimony like some kind of religious believer. However, if we look at the Wilbur-Combs matrix, I have had experiences at each one of these levels: blue, orange, green, integral. I'm a long-time meditative practitioner. I was raised a Christian, and I'm also an agnostic and an atheist. So I've definitely had the subtle state experiences that often happen at blue through a Christian tradition. I've had the rational, exterior knowledge, understanding of enlightenment that comes online at orange. And I've had the green, all is one awakening experience, and even the Nirvikalpa Samadhi meditative experiences in Buddhism. And of course, at green is also where I started experimenting with lots of different psychedelic drugs. And I've had these non-dual experiences and perspectives on enlightenment at the integral stages, including both the absolute and relative truth. I would say also balancing the sacred and the mundane. So different experiences of enlightenment, of unity, of interconnectedness at different stages, interpreted in different ways, emphasizing different states. So if we look at the Wilbur-Combs matrix, basically what we see is that vertical development has to do with stages, and then horizontal development has to do with states. And we say that states are free and stages are earned. In other words, you can get into any state at any stage. Anybody at any stage can get into any state. But you will always interpret that state from whatever stage of development that you're at. So what often happens is when you are critical of a person and you say, I don't know if your enlightenment experience is really true, they'll be like,
"Are you calling me a liar? Are you trying to say I didn't have this experience?"
And it's like, no, I question your interpretation of the experience. For example, if I went to my friend and he's like,
"Listen, I'm not going to be able to talk you into believing in Christianity. The only way that you're really going to know is if you come with me to church and you have an experience."
So he talks me into it. I go with him to church and they're having this worship ceremony and the music is really beautiful, and we get to this part where the music quiets down and the pastor is like,
"God is pulling on your heart right now. He's telling you,
You've done things wrong.
So like you're being hypnotized basically and told this story about this feeling that you have and what it means. And so if I experience this and I go along with it, that means that the story of Jesus on the cross from mythology is a historical event. That's the evidence for this personal experience, my experience of Jesus in my heart and being saved. This is a good translation of this experience? No. It's an inside the box, inside the tradition, circular reasoning interpretation of what happened, as if what I was experiencing was actually Jesus in my heart and not just the power of suggestion that this preacher guy has put on me. The same thing happens in Buddhism. The idea that when you achieve this kind of state of stopping your mind and being in pure stillness, pure black emptiness, as soon as you get into this state, your body gives you all this chemical explosion of feel-goodness. And you're like, you have a Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And then people say,
"See, this proves that emptiness is the ground of all being. This proves it, because if you can get into this state and have this amazing experience, then that's how you know."
See, there's some steps missing in the logic here. This is why it's good to ask people how they come to their conclusions and to spell out the logic, because as soon as you start spelling out the logic, it becomes very clear where the circular reasoning is happening. Why do you think it was Jesus in your heart? Or why do you think that this was the ground of all being or the absolute?
Well, because that's what the religion says that it is. And so when I experienced it and it looked like that, I just assumed that that's what it was and that these people were right, and I interpreted my experience in those terms.
But there are other people who have these experiences who don't look at it in those terms, who don't take that stuff literally, who don't come to those conclusions on the back of these experiences. And if this is a for real deep science type of approach,
This is evidence.
these spiritual experiences are only evidence for the conclusion if the logic in the problem holds true. And that's the problem, is the logic isn't good. There's a problem with the first premise. It was Jesus in your heart that made you feel these things, or it was the ground of all being that you were getting in touch with is what made your special experience so amazing. No, it was actually music. No, it was actually biochemistry. There are very practical and rational reasons for these things. And if anyone was actually bold enough to put their logic on the table, if we were actually talking about some trans-rational ideas here, which included rational descriptions, we would be able to point to the errors and the problems in the logic. But these people don't actually put their logic on the table. They commit the pre-trans fallacy. The other insight this Wilbur-Combs matrix brings is this understanding that whatever your interpretation of an experience is, it says more about you and your stage of development than it does about the actual truth of reality. And that is very much the case when it comes to ideas like enlightenment. So I hope on the back of this video that you will be able to listen to what a person thinks enlightenment is and have a good idea about what stage of cognitive development they're actually at based on their interpretation. I hope you enjoyed this talk. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Buy the merch. Support me on Patreon. Big thanks to my current Patreons. I love in each and every one of you wonderful people. Become a Patreon. Get on this list. Support what I do. And peace!